The clock on the wall of room 302 ticked steadily as Dr. James Chen wrote another equation on the whiteboard. The smell of dry erase markers filled the air of the stuffy classroom. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, creating a gentle soundtrack to the afternoon calculus lecture at Westlake Community College. James had been teaching advanced mathematics for 15 years now. He could almost predict which students would struggle with today's concept just by looking at their faces. In the front row, Alex was already frowning at his notes. 2 rows back, Priya was nodding confidently as she followed along. The basketball players, Tom and Kevin, were in their usual spots near the door, paying just enough attention to pass the course. So when we apply this formula to our problem, James said, tapping the board with his marker, we can find the rate of change at any point on our curve. He turned to face the 23 students, all in their late teens or early 20s. They stared back with varying degrees of interest and confusion. The classroom door creaked open. James paused mid-explanation. Everyone turned to look as an elderly woman with silver hair stepped into the room. She wore a simple blue cardigan and carried a worn leather bag. Water droplets sparkled on her shoulders from the rain outside. For a moment, James thought she might be lost. Older adults occasionally wandered into the wrong building on campus, looking for the community education classes or the administration office. The woman said nothing. She simply closed the door quietly behind her and took the empty seat in the back corner of the room. She removed a notebook and pen from her bag and looked up at James expectantly. A few students exchanged puzzled glances. Someone snickered. James cleared his throat. As I was saying, he continued, turning back to the board, this formula allows us to calculate the instantaneous rate of change. For the next 45 minutes, James explained derivatives, drawing diagrams and working through increasingly complex problems. Occasionally, he glanced at the old woman. Unlike most of his students, who shifted restlessly or checked their phones when they thought he wasn't looking, she remained perfectly still, her pen moving steadily across her notebook page. When the class ended, students packed up quickly, eager to get to their next class or head home for the day. The basketball players were first out the door, followed by a cluster of friends discussing weekend plans. Soon the room was empty except for James and the elderly woman. She approached his desk slowly, her steps careful but purposeful. Up close, James could see the fine lines around her bright blue eyes and the way her hands, though slightly spotted with age, moved with precision as she clutched her notebook. I hope you don't mind my sitting in, she said, her voice stronger than James had expected. I've always loved mathematics, but I never got the chance to study it properly. James set down his marker, intrigued. Not at all. I'm Dr. Chen, James Chen. Are you interested in enrolling in the course? The woman smiled. My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm 78 years old, and yes, I'd like to take this class officially, if that's possible. I've been teaching myself from books for years, but there's nothing quite like a proper classroom, is there? James leaned against his desk, surprised. Most of his older students were in their 30s or 40s, taking night classes to finish degrees they'd started years earlier. He'd never had a student in their 70s, especially not in advanced calculus. Have you taken the prerequisites? This is a third-level course, Margaret nodded. I've been working through the textbooks for the earlier courses on my own. I believe I understand the material. Of course, I might be a bit rusty on some concepts. James hesitated. He didn't want to set her up for failure, but her confidence intrigued him. Why don't you look over today's problems and see if they make sense to you? The registration office is still open for another hour if you want to officially sign up. Margaret opened her notebook and showed him her notes from the lecture. James blinked in surprise. Not only had she followed along, but her notes were impeccably organized, with additional comments in the margins showing connections to other mathematical concepts. These are excellent notes. Mrs. Wilson, please call me Margaret, and thank you. Mathematics has always made sense to me like a beautiful language. I just never had the chance to speak it properly. What stopped you? James asked, genuinely curious. Margaret's eyes drifted to the rain-streaked window. Life, I suppose. I started college in 1965, planning to major in mathematics. I was one of only 3 women in the program. She smiled faintly at the memory. But my parents fell ill during my first year. Back then, it was expected that a daughter would care for aging parents. My brothers had their own families, their own careers. So I left school to look after them. James nodded sympathetically. And you never went back? By the time both my parents had passed, I'd met my husband, William. We got married and I took a job as a bookkeeper at his family's hardware store. It was a good life, but not the one I'd planned. She straightened her shoulders. William died last year. Our children are grown with families of their own. For the first time in decades, I have only myself to think about. So here I am. James found himself smiling. Well, Margaret, I think you'll make an excellent addition to the class. The registration office is in the main building. Tell them I sent you and they'll help you get set up. Thank you, Dr. Chen. I appreciate your openness. Most people see an old woman and assume I'm here to ask about knitting classes or gardening workshops. James laughed. I never assume anything about my students anymore. I've been surprised too many times. After Margaret left, James packed up his materials, thinking about her story. In 15 years of teaching, he'd never considered how many potential mathematicians had been diverted from their path by circumstances. How many brilliant minds had never had the chance to develop their abilities. The following Thursday, James arrived at class to find Margaret already seated in the back row. She wore a different cardigan, green this time, but had the same worn leather bag and attentive expression. Several students glanced curiously in her direction as they took their seats. Good afternoon, everyone. Beer, James began. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to welcome a new student to our class. Margaret Wilson has joined us for the semester. A few students nodded politely. Others looked surprised. James heard one young man whisper to his friend, "Is she auditing or something?" "Mrs. Wilson is enrolled just like the rest of you," James said pointedly. "Now let's pick up where we left off on Tuesday." As the lecture progressed, James noticed several students watching Margaret when they thought no one was looking. She didn't seem to notice, focused entirely on her notes and the equations on the board. When James asked questions, a few hands would go up, usually the same students who always participated. Margaret never raised her hand, though James could see her writing down the answers in her notebook. When class ended, a small group of students lingered, watching as Margaret carefully packed her things. One of them, a young woman named Priya, who usually sat near the front, approached her. "Excuse me, Mrs. Wilson? I'm Priya. I just wanted to say hello and welcome to the class." Margaret looked up, seeming surprised at being addressed. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you. Have you studied calculus before?" Priya asked. "Only on my own," Margaret replied. "From books. This is my first formal class. Another student joined them. I'm Zach. That's pretty cool that you're taking this course. Most people your age wouldn't bother with something so difficult." James, who was erasing the board, winced at Zach's clumsy comment, but Margaret just chuckled. "Most people any age wouldn't bother with something difficult, but difficulty doesn't scare me. Besides, mathematics isn't just about solving problems. It's about seeing patterns in the world around us." Priya nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly how I feel about it. My friends think I'm weird for loving math, but I can't imagine studying anything else." As the small group chatted, James observed them with satisfaction. He'd worried that Margaret might feel isolated among students young enough to be her grandchildren, but it seemed that a shared interest in mathematics was building bridges across the generations. Over the next few weeks, Margaret became a familiar presence in the classroom. She never spoke up during discussions, never volunteered to solve problems at the board. She simply took meticulous notes and submitted her homework on time. James was impressed with her work, not perfect, but showing a deep understanding of the material. What James didn't know was that Margaret spent 3 hours every night working through practice problems, determined not to fall behind. She didn't want special treatment. She didn't want to be the cute old lady taking a math class for fun. She wanted to truly understand, to finally pursue the path she'd abandoned 60 years earlier. James also didn't know that some students had started making comments when Margaret wasn't around. "Why is she even here?" one young man named David would ask. "It's not like she's going to use this for a career." Others were more openly unkind. "She's probably just bored and lonely," someone suggested. "Old people do weird things for attention." These comments hadn't yet reached James's ears, but they were about to, and they would set in motion events that would surprise everyone, especially the doubters. Because Margaret Wilson was hiding something behind her quiet demeanor and careful notes, something that would soon leave the entire class, including Dr. James Chen himself, completely speechless. The small apartment on Maple Street was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks, worksheets, and a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The clock showed 11:30 p.m., but sleep was far from her mind as she worked through a particularly challenging problem from last week's class. "If I take the derivative here," she muttered to herself, tapping her pencil against the paper. Her fingers, though not as nimble as they once were, moved with practiced precision. The small table lamp cast a warm glow over her work, the only light in the otherwise darkened apartment. Margaret had been living alone in this modest two-bedroom apartment since William passed away 14 months ago. Their wedding photo sat on the bookshelf nearby. Margaret in a simple white dress, William in his Navy uniform, both of them young and full of dreams. 53 years of marriage had given her 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories, but none of them knew about her secret passion. Margaret glanced at the worn cardboard box in the corner of the room. It had followed her through 4 moves, always carefully packed and unpacked, though she rarely showed its contents to anyone. Tonight she pulled it closer and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of notebooks, dating back to 1965. Each one was filled with mathematical equations, problems and solutions, a hidden record of a dream deferred. Margaret pulled out one of the oldest notebooks, its pages yellowed with age. Her handwriting was different then, larger, more confident, full of the enthusiasm of youth. "Introduction to Abstract Algebra," read her neat heading at the top of the page, dated September 15, 1965. "Professor Richards, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2:06 p.m. Margaret smiled, remembering the tall, serious man who had seemed ancient to her 19-year-old self, though he was probably younger then than she was now. She had been one of only 3 women in that class, fighting to be taken seriously in a world that expected her to study home economics or nursing, if she attended college at all. She turned the pages, seeing her careful notes and solved problems. She'd been good, really good. Professor Richards had even told her she had a mathematician's mind, high praise coming from him. Then halfway through the notebook, the careful notes stopped abruptly. The next entry, dated November 12th, was scribbled hastily. "Dad in hospital. Going home tomorrow. We'll try to keep up with assignments." Margaret closed the notebook, the memories washing over her. Her father's stroke had come without warning. One day he was tending his beloved garden. The next he was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak or move his right side. Her mother, overwhelmed with caring for him, had called Margaret home from college. "Just until he's better," her mother had promised. Just for a little while. But a little while had turned into months and months into years. Her father had never fully recovered, and by the time he passed away 5 years later, Margaret's mother had developed heart problems of her own. Margaret's brothers, Robert and George, had their own families by then, their own careers that couldn't be interrupted. No one had questioned that it would be Margaret, the unmarried daughter, who would set aside her own plans to care for their parents. Margaret placed the old notebook back in the box and pulled out another, this one from the 1970s. By then she had met William at the church picnic. He ran his family's hardware store and needed someone to keep the books. Margaret, with her head for numbers, was perfect for the job. "You're wasted as a bookkeeper," William had told her once. "You could have been a professor or an engineer." He had understood in his way. But it was a different time. Women like Margaret didn't resume their education at 30. Especially not in fields like mathematics. They got married, kept house, raised children, and so she had. But William had given her a gift without realizing it. Every year on her birthday he would buy her books, not novels or cookbooks, but mathematics textbooks. "To keep that brain of yours busy," he would say with a smile. And so, over the decades, while raising their children and helping run the store, Margaret had taught herself calculus, differential equations, linear algebra, number theory. Each night after the children were in bed, she would sit at the kitchen table and work through problems by lamplight. No one knew how far she had gone with her studies. Her children thought the textbooks were just an eccentric hobby. "Mom and her puzzles," they would say fondly. Even William hadn't fully understood the depth of her knowledge or her passion. How could he? She herself hadn't realized how much she had accomplished, until she started attending Dr. Chen's class and discovered that she already knew most of the material he was teaching. Margaret finished her tea and looked at the clock. Nearly midnight. She should get to bed. Tomorrow was another class day. But the problem she was working on was almost solved, and she couldn't leave it unfinished. 20 minutes later, solution complete, Margaret packed up her books and notes. Her back ached from sitting too long and her eyes were tired, but her mind felt alive. This was why she had finally enrolled in formal classes after all these years. Not for the degree. What use did a 78-year-old widow have for a college degree? But for the joy of learning among others who shared her passion, for the structure and challenge of it. As she climbed into bed, Margaret thought about her classmates, most of them young enough to be her grandchildren. They were polite enough, but she could sense their confusion about her presence. The girl Priya had been genuinely friendly, and a few others had made efforts to include her in pre-class conversations. But most kept their distance, as if her age might be contagious, and then there were the ones who were openly dismissive. Margaret wasn't deaf. She had heard the whispers. "What's Grandma doing here? Is this like a senior citizen field trip?" She pretended not to notice, but the comments stung more than she cared to admit. Dr. Chen, at least, treated her like any other student. He graded her work without special consideration, corrected her mistakes, and acknowledged her successes. She appreciated that more than he probably realized. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully in slacks and a purple sweater, one of her better outfits. She packed a sandwich and an apple for lunch, filled her thermos with coffee, and caught the 9:15 bus to campus. The bus driver, Carl, greeted her warmly. "Off to school again, Mrs. Wilson?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday," she replied with a smile. "Never too old to learn something new. That's what I always say." Carl nodded approvingly. Margaret didn't correct his assumption that she was learning something new. How could she explain that she was finally, after 60 years, pursuing knowledge she had been gathering in secret all her adult life? The college campus was bustling with activity when she arrived. Young people hurried in all directions, backpacks slung over shoulders, phones in hand. Margaret made her way slowly to the mathematics building, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the sound of leaves crunching beneath her feet. She arrived at room 302 20 minutes early, as was her habit. The classroom was empty except for Dr. Chen, who was writing equations on the whiteboard for today's lecture. "Good morning, Margaret," he said without turning around. "You're early as usual." "I like to get settled before everyone arrives," she explained, taking her seat in the back corner. "And I wanted to ask you about problem 7 from last week's homework. I think there might be 2 possible approaches." Dr. Chen set down his marker and came to look at her work. "You're right," he said, sounding impressed. "Most students only see the first method. The second one is actually more elegant, but it requires seeing the pattern from a different angle." "Good catch." Margaret felt a small glow of pride. Maybe she did belong here after all. As the other students began to file in, Margaret opened her notebook and prepared for class. Today they would be covering integration by parts, a technique she had taught herself years ago while sitting beside her father's hospital bed, finding escape in the orderly world of mathematics, while the real world seemed to be falling apart around her. None of her classmates knew that. The quiet old woman in the back row had once dreamed of becoming a research mathematician. None of them could guess at the depth of knowledge hidden behind her polite smile and careful notes. None of them suspected that mathematics had been her sanctuary through life's hardest moments, her secret joy during decades of routine. But perhaps, someday soon, they would find out, because Margaret Wilson had not come back to school simply to learn. She had come back to finally claim the identity she had set aside all those years ago, and she was just waiting for the right moment to show them all what she could do. 3 weeks into the semester, the novelty of having an elderly student in the advanced calculus class had worn off. Most students had settled back into their usual routines, focusing on their own struggles with the increasingly complex material. Dr. Chen's lectures had grown more challenging as they delved deeper into the course content, and the atmosphere in room 302 had shifted from curious to tense. Margaret continued to sit in her corner spot, arriving early and leaving quietly after each class. She never spoke during discussions, never raised her hand to answer questions. Her homework assignments were always turned in on time, neatly written and mostly correct. To an outside observer, she might have seemed like the perfect student, present, attentive, and hard-working. But Dr. Chen noticed something that troubled him. While some students, like Priya, would occasionally chat with Margaret before or after class, others had begun to show subtle signs of resentment. He caught looks exchanged when Margaret asked him questions after lecture. He overheard snippets of conversation in the hallway that made his jaw clench. Why doesn't she just take a senior citizen art class or something? I bet Professor Chen just feels sorry for her. She's probably just lonely and has nothing better to do. The worst offender was Tyler Jenkins, a 20-year-old sophomore who had never had to work hard for his grades. Blessed with a natural aptitude for mathematics and an unfortunately inflated ego to match, Tyler had developed a particularly dismissive attitude toward Margaret. He would sigh loudly whenever she spoke to Dr. Chen after class. He would roll his eyes when she took too long gathering her things. Once, Dr. Chen had even caught him mimicking her careful, slightly arthritic walk when he thought no one important was watching. On a rainy Thursday 3 weeks into the semester, things came to a head. Dr. Chen was explaining a particularly difficult concept involving differential equations. Most of the students were struggling to follow along, their foreheads creased with concentration. Even Priya, usually quick to understand, was frantically scribbling notes and looking confused. Dr. Chen paused in his explanation to ask, "Does everyone follow so far? Any questions before we move on?" The room was silent. No one wanted to be the first to admit confusion. Dr. Chen sighed internally, familiar with this reluctance. Really? No questions at all? This is complex material. I'd be surprised if everyone understood it perfectly on the first pass. Tyler, slouched in his seat near the middle of the room, spoke up. It's not that complicated if you've been paying attention for the past few weeks. He glanced pointedly toward the back corner where Margaret sat. But I guess some people might be having trouble keeping up. A few students chuckled nervously. Others looked uncomfortable. Margaret kept her eyes on her notebook, her expression carefully neutral, though a slight flush crept up her neck. Dr. Chen felt a flash of anger. He'd been teaching long enough to recognize the toxic combination of arrogance and insecurity that drove students like Tyler to put others down. Usually he would address such behavior privately after class, but something about the smug look on Tyler's face, contrasted with Margaret's quiet dignity, made him decide to handle things differently today. You seem very confident in your understanding. Tyler, Dr. Chen said, keeping his voice pleasant. That's good. Confidence is important in mathematics. He turned to write on the whiteboard again. Since everyone seems so comfortable with the material, let's try a more challenging application. He began writing an equation on the board, one significantly more complex than anything they had tackled so far. It wasn't beyond the scope of the course, but it combined multiple techniques they had covered and required creative problem-solving to work through efficiently. Dr. Chen had planned to introduce this level of complexity next week, but Tyler's attitude had changed his mind. The students watched in growing dismay as the equation sprawled across the board, filling nearly the entire space with symbols, functions, and variables. When Dr. Chen finally stepped back, there was an audible groan from several students. This equation represents a real-world problem in physics, Dr. Chen explained. The kind of challenge working mathematicians face regularly. I'd like someone to come up and walk us through a solution approach. No hands went up, not even Tyler's. The confident smirk had slipped from his face, replaced by a look of intense concentration as he stared at the board. No volunteers? Dr. Chen asked, raising an eyebrow. Tyler, would you like to demonstrate your understanding for the class? Tyler's head snapped up, his expression trapped. I'd need a few minutes to think it through first. That's reasonable, Dr. Chen nodded. Mathematics isn't about quick answers. It's about thoughtful problem solving. He scanned the room, making eye contact with various students, none of whom seemed eager to approach the board. Then his gaze settled on Margaret, sitting quietly in her corner. A thought struck him. Throughout the weeks, he had graded Margaret's homework and found it consistently strong. Her approach to problems was sometimes unusual, not following the textbook methods exactly, but arriving at correct solutions through her own path. He had been curious about her mathematical background but hadn't found the right opportunity to ask. Perhaps this was that opportunity. Margaret, he said, his voice gentler now, would you be willing to try this problem? The entire class turned to look at Margaret. She appeared startled, her blue eyes widening behind her reading glasses. For a moment, Dr. Chen regretted putting her on the spot. What if he had misjudged her abilities? What if she felt humiliated in front of these young people who already doubted her place among them? But something in Margaret's expression shifted. The surprise gave way to something else. Determination, perhaps. Or was it relief? She closed her notebook carefully, stood up, and made her way to the front of the classroom. Her steps were slow but purposeful. Tyler made no attempt to hide his amusement. "This should be interesting," he whispered to the student beside him, just loud enough for his voice to carry through the quiet room. A few uncomfortable laughs followed. Dr. Chen shot Tyler a warning look, then turned to Margaret with an encouraging smile. "Take your time," he said, offering her a marker. "Just talk us through your thinking process." Margaret accepted the marker, her fingers closing around it with surprising firmness. She stood before the board, her small frame dwarfed by the complex equation that covered most of the white surface. For a long moment she just stared at it, not writing anything, not speaking. The silence in the room grew heavy. Dr. Chen could feel the collective discomfort of his students. Some were probably embarrassed for Margaret, assuming she was overwhelmed. Others might be impatient, wondering why their professor had put this elderly woman in such an awkward position. Dr. Chen himself was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake. Then Margaret spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "This equation is modeling fluid dynamics, isn't it? Specifically, the behavior of a non-Newtonian fluid under variable pressure." Dr. Chen couldn't hide his surprise. "That's correct." "How did you know?" A small smile played at the corners of Margaret's mouth. "The structure is distinctive. I've seen similar formulations in a book I read about 20 years ago." She uncapped the marker. "There are several ways to approach this, but I think I'll use a substitution method first to simplify the left side." She began to write on the board, her hand moving with increasing confidence. The scratching of the marker was the only sound in the otherwise silent classroom. Every student was watching intently now, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disbelief. Tyler sat up straighter in his chair, his earlier amusement fading as he watched Margaret work. She wasn't hesitating or second-guessing herself. She was methodically breaking down the complex equation into more manageable parts, applying techniques they had learned in class but combining them in ways they hadn't yet discussed. Dr. Chen observed with growing amazement. Margaret wasn't just solving the problem. She was using an elegant approach he himself might not have considered immediately. Where had she learned this? Who was this quiet woman who had been sitting in the back of his classroom, never drawing attention to herself or her apparently considerable mathematical knowledge? After about 2 minutes of writing, Margaret paused and stepped back, studying what she had done so far. She frowned slightly, erased a small section, and rewrote it. Then she continued, moving to the right side of the equation. The class remained transfixed. Even those students who typically checked their phones during lecture were fully engaged, watching this unexpected drama unfold. Dr. Chen glanced at his watch. Nearly 10 minutes had passed since Margaret had approached the board. She was still working steadily, her concentration unwavering. "Notice how she's factoring out these terms," Dr. Chen pointed out to the class, unable to contain his own enthusiasm for the elegant solution taking shape. "This is actually a technique that wasn't in your textbook. It's a more advanced approach that simplifies the next steps considerably." A few students nodded, though most were simply trying to follow along with Margaret's work. Tyler was scribbling frantically in his notebook, trying to understand each step she was taking. Finally, after nearly 15 minutes, Margaret wrote a final line at the bottom of the board. She stepped back, reviewed her work once more, and turned to face the class. "I believe that's the solution," she said simply, placing the marker back on Dr. Chen's desk, "though I'd welcome any corrections if I've made an error." Dr. Chen stepped forward to examine her work, tracing through each step carefully. The classroom remained silent as he checked her solution. After a minute, he turned to the class with an expression of genuine amazement. "This," he said, gesturing to Margaret's work, "is not just correct. It's brilliant. Margaret has used a solution method that combines several techniques in a way that's both elegant and efficient." He turned to Margaret. "Where did you learn this approach?" "It's not something we've covered in class." Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly. "I read about it in a journal article from 1978. A mathematician named Helen Thompson published it as an alternative method for solving certain types of differential equations. I always found it more intuitive than the standard approach." The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Students who had dismissed Margaret now looked at her with new eyes. Tyler sat frozen in his seat, his expression unreadable. Dr. Chen looked at Margaret with newfound respect and a touch of curiosity. What other mathematical knowledge was this quiet, unassuming woman hiding? And how would this moment change the dynamics of his classroom going forward? As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, no one moved immediately to leave. All eyes remained on the elderly woman who had just shattered every assumption they had made about her. The classroom remained frozen in a moment of collective amazement. Margaret stood beside the whiteboard, her small figure somehow larger now, transformed by what she had just accomplished. The complex equation, solved with elegant precision, stretched across the board behind her like a testament to decades of hidden knowledge. Dr. Chen was the first to break the silence. "Thank you, Margaret. That was exceptional." His voice carried a warmth and respect that hadn't been there before, not because he had disrespected her previously, but because he now saw her in an entirely new light. A smattering of applause broke out, started by Priya in the front row and quickly joined by others. The sound grew until most of the class was clapping. Margaret blinked, clearly surprised by the reaction. A faint blush colored her cheeks as she made her way back to her seat. Her eyes fixed on the floor. Only Tyler remained still, his hands in his lap, his expression a complicated mix of embarrassment and disbelief. His earlier smugness had evaporated completely. "That," Dr. Chen said, addressing the whole class once the applause died down, "is exactly the kind of creative problem-solving that mathematics at this level requires." Notice how Margaret approached the problem from a different angle than what we've been practicing. There's an important lesson here about looking beyond the obvious solution path. He turned toward the board, using Margaret's work as a teaching tool, explaining certain steps she had taken. Most students were frantically taking notes, trying to capture the method she had used. For Margaret, the experience was surreal. After decades of solving equations in the privacy of her kitchen, with only her notebooks as witness, having an entire classroom of young people look at her work with such attention felt like stepping out of a shadow she hadn't fully realized she'd been living in. When the bell rang, students gathered their things slowly, many of them glancing toward Margaret with new interest. As she packed her notebook into her worn leather bag, Priya approached her desk. "That was amazing," the young woman said, genuine admiration in her voice. "I've never seen that method before. Would you mind showing me how you approached it? Maybe over coffee sometime?" Before Margaret could respond, two more students joined them. "I'd like to join too, if that's okay," said a tall young man with glasses whom Margaret recognized as Anthony. "I've been struggling with these concepts." "Me too," added a girl with short dark hair. "I'm Lisa. I sit 2 rows in front of you. I've wanted to introduce myself, but..." She trailed off, looking slightly ashamed. Margaret felt a lump forming in her throat. For 3 weeks she had sat in this classroom feeling like an outsider, an oddity, tolerated but not truly included. Now suddenly these young people were looking at her not as an elderly curiosity, but as someone with knowledge worth sharing. "I'd be happy to," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "How about the campus coffee shop? Tomorrow afternoon?" They agreed on a time, and Margaret watched them leave, still hardly believing what had just happened. As the classroom emptied, only Dr. Chen remained, erasing the board but intentionally leaving Margaret's solution untouched. "I hope you don't mind my putting you on the spot like that," he said without turning around. "I had a feeling you were holding back in class, though I admit I didn't expect quite that level of mastery." Margaret adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "I should be thanking you," she said quietly. "I've been solving problems like that for most of my life, but only on paper, only for myself. It felt," she searched for the right word, "validating to do it in front of others." Dr. Chen set down the eraser and turned to face her. "May I ask where you learned mathematics at this level?" "You mentioned reading journal articles." Margaret smiled, memories washing over her. "My husband, William, worked at the university library for a few years after he sold his hardware store. He would bring home mathematics journals that were being discarded, knowing I loved the subject. Over time, I accumulated quite a collection." She hesitated, then decided to share more. "And there was a professor, Dr. Eleanor Wright, who used to come into our hardware store. Somehow we got to talking about mathematics. When she learned about my interest, she started lending me books and papers. We would discuss them when she came in to buy supplies for her garden. It was our secret little mathematics club, just the two of us among the hammers and nails." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. Eleanor Wright, the pioneering woman mathematician who developed the Wright method for solving systems of differential equations? Margaret nodded. Yes, though I just knew her as the nice lady who bought a lot of gardening tools and talked to me about math. I didn't realize how important she was in the field until years after she passed away. That's extraordinary, Dr. Chen said, leaning against his desk. Dr. Wright was a legend in mathematics. Her methods revolutionized several areas of applied mathematics in the 1970s and 80s. He shook his head in amazement. And she was teaching you informally all that time. Not teaching exactly, Margaret corrected gently. We discussed ideas as equals. She said I had good instincts. A soft laugh escaped her. I think she was just being kind. After what I saw today, I doubt that very much, Dr. Chen replied. The approach you used, it incorporated elements of Wright's method, didn't it? Margaret nodded, pleased that he had recognized it. Yes. Eleanor always said that mathematics was like a language with many dialects. Most people learn only one way to express an idea, but there are often many equally valid approaches. Outside in the hallway, students passed by the open door, their voices creating a backdrop of youthful energy. Margaret glanced at her watch, suddenly aware of the time. I should go, she said. I promised my daughter I'd call her this afternoon. Dr. Chen nodded, but as Margaret turned to leave, he spoke again. Would you consider sharing your approach with the class more regularly? Not just solving problems at the board, but perhaps explaining your thinking. I think the students could learn a lot from your perspective. Margaret paused, surprised by the suggestion. You want me to teach? Not formally, Dr. Chen clarified. But yes, in a way. You have knowledge and experience that could benefit everyone, including me. Mathematics isn't just about getting the right answer. It's about seeing patterns and connections. You clearly have a unique way of seeing both. The idea was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying to Margaret. I'll think about it, she promised. As she left the mathematics building, Margaret felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she had carried for decades had been partially lifted. All those years of studying alone, of keeping her passion hidden as if it were something to be ashamed of, they suddenly felt different in retrospect, not wasted but preparing her for this unexpected moment in her life. The campus was quiet now, most students having left for the day. Margaret sat down on a bench beneath an old oak tree, its leaves turning golden in the autumn sunlight. She took out her cell phone, a simple model her grandson had insisted she get for emergencies, and dialed her daughter's number. Mom, is everything okay? Karen answered, concern in her voice. Margaret rarely called during the day. Everything's fine, dear, Margaret assured her. Better than fine, actually. Something happened today that I wanted to share with you. What is it? Karen asked, her tone relaxing. Margaret took a deep breath. Do you remember all those mathematics books your father used to buy me? The ones you and your brothers teased me about? Sure, Karen replied, sounding confused by the change of subject. Your puzzles, right? Dad always said you had the sharpest mind he'd ever known. Well, Margaret said, a smile spreading across her face. It turns out he might have been right. As she recounted the day's events to her astonished daughter, Margaret gazed at the students crossing the campus quad, young people full of potential and promise. For the first time, she didn't feel separate from them, like a relic from another era. She felt connected, part of the same continuum of learning and discovery. Across the quad, she spotted Tyler walking alone, his shoulders hunched, his face still showing traces of the afternoon's humiliation. For a moment, Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for him. Pride was a treacherous companion, especially for the young. She had learned that lesson herself many years ago. Tomorrow, if he came to the study group she was apparently now leading, she would make a special effort to help him understand the method she had used. Not to prove her superiority, but because mathematics had been her lifeline during difficult times, her joy during happy ones. If she could share even a fraction of that with these young people, then perhaps her long, solitary journey with numbers had a greater purpose than she had ever imagined. As the autumn sun warmed her face, Margaret Wilson allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she had hidden even from herself. She wasn't just someone who enjoyed mathematics. She was and always had been a mathematician, and for the first time in her 78 years, the world was beginning to see her that way too. The campus coffee shop buzzed with afternoon activity. Students hunched over laptops, professors graded papers, and friends chatted over steaming cups. In the corner, An unusual study group had gathered around a table meant for 4 but now crowded with 6. At the center sat Margaret, a textbook open before her, explaining a concept with patient precision. Around her, 5 young students listened intently, nodding and taking notes. Among them was Tyler, sitting slightly apart from the others, his expression a mixture of reluctance and fascination. "So you see," Margaret was saying, her finger tracing an equation. "When we approach it this way, the pattern becomes clear. It's like looking at a tapestry from the back and then turning it over to see the design." Priya's face lit up with sudden understanding. "That makes so much more sense. The textbook makes it so complicated." "Different explanations work for different minds," Margaret replied. "That's why it's good to have many perspectives." She glanced at Tyler, who had been silent throughout the session. "What do you think, Tyler? Does this approach make sense to you?" He looked startled at being addressed directly. Yeah, I guess so." He hesitated, then added grudgingly, "It's more straightforward than what Professor Chen showed us." It had been 3 weeks since Margaret had solved the complex equation at the board. 3 weeks of gradual but profound change. What had begun as a one-time coffee shop meeting had evolved into regular study sessions. Word had spread among the students of advanced calculus, and the group had grown from 3 to 5, with others occasionally dropping by. Even Tyler had eventually joined, though his first appearance a week ago had clearly cost him considerable pride. He had stood awkwardly at their table, backpack clutched in front of him like a shield. "Is it okay if I sit in?" he had asked, his eyes focused somewhere over Margaret's left shoulder. "I'm having trouble with the latest assignment." Margaret had simply pulled out the empty chair next to her. "Of course. We were just discussing integration techniques." Now, as the study session wound down, Priya gathered her books. "Same time on Thursday?" Margaret nodded. "I'll be here." As the students dispersed, Tyler lingered, seemingly wrestling with something he wanted to say. Margaret gave him time, calmly packing her own books into her leather bag. Finally, he spoke. "I wanted to apologize." Margaret looked up, surprised. "For how I acted before," he continued, the words coming in a rush now. I was a jerk. I thought you were just some old lady who didn't belong in our class." "I was wrong." Margaret studied his face. There was genuine remorse there, mixed with the awkwardness of youth. "Apology accepted," she said simply. Tyler nodded, relief washing over his features. "How did you get so good at this stuff? I mean, without a degree or anything?" Margaret smiled. "One problem at a time over many years. Mathematics doesn't care about degrees, Tyler. It only cares about whether your solution works." He considered this. "Would you look at my approach to the homework? I tried using your method, but I think I missed something." "Of course," she agreed. As they bent over his notebook, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction. This young man, so full of himself just weeks ago, was now asking for her help. Not because she had humiliated him, but because she had shown him another way of seeing. Later that afternoon, Margaret made her way to Dr. Chen's office for their weekly meeting. This too had become a regular occurrence since her demonstration in class. What had begun as casual conversations about mathematics had evolved into something more formal. Dr. Chen looked up from his computer as she knocked on his open door. "Margaret, come in. I was just reviewing your notes." On his desk lay a stack of Margaret's notebooks, the pages filled with her careful handwriting. The oldest ones, from the 1970s, contained her work on differential equations, including the approach she had learned from Dr. Eleanor Wright. "These are remarkable," Dr. Chen said, gesturing to the notebooks. "You've essentially developed a variation on Wright's method that streamlines the solution process for a whole class of differential equations. Have you ever considered publishing this work?" Margaret sat down, placing her bag in her lap. "Publishing? No, that never occurred to me. Those are just my personal notes." "They're much more than that," Dr. Chen insisted. "You've made a genuine contribution to the field, whether you realized it or not. Your approach combines Wright's initial framework with elements that make it more accessible and broadly applicable." He turned his computer screen so she could see it. "I've drafted an outline for a paper. With your permission, I'd like to help you develop these ideas for publication. You would be the primary author, of course." Margaret stared at the screen, where Dr. Chen had typed a streamlined approach to Wright's method for solving complex differential equations, with her name listed as the author. Beneath his desk, her hands gripped her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. I'm not an academic, she said finally. I don't have credentials. You have something better, Dr. Chen replied. You have original ideas and the mathematical skill to develop them. The work speaks for itself. For a moment, Margaret was transported back to her parents' kitchen table in 1965. The acceptance letter from the university mathematics program in her hands, her father's voice saying, "That's nice, dear. But that's not a practical path for a young woman. Do you really think my work is worthy of publication?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotion welling inside her. Without question, Dr. Chen said firmly. Mathematics journals care about the quality of the ideas, not the age or background of the person who developed them. As they discussed the details, Margaret felt as if a circle was completing itself. The young woman who had reluctantly set aside her mathematical dreams was now, in her 8th decade, being invited to claim her place in the field. Over the next 2 months, Margaret's life transformed in ways she could never have anticipated when she first slipped into the back of Dr. Chen's classroom. The study group continued to grow, with Margaret becoming a sought-after tutor. Students from other mathematics classes began to seek her out, drawn by word of mouth about the math genius grandma, who could explain difficult concepts with unusual clarity. In class, she no longer sat silently in the back corner. She participated in discussions, sometimes offering alternative approaches that made complex ideas more accessible. Dr. Chen often invited her to demonstrate different solution methods, presenting her as a valuable resource rather than just another student. The paper progressed steadily. Margaret spent hours in the university library, reviewing the literature, refining her ideas, and working with Dr. Chen to shape her decades of personal exploration into a formal academic contribution. At 78, she was learning yet another new skill, the art of scientific writing. On a bright December morning, as the semester neared its end, Margaret arrived at class to find an unusual atmosphere of excitement. Students whispered among themselves, glancing her way with secretive smiles. Dr. Chen stood at the front of the room, looking particularly pleased about something. "Before we begin today," he announced once everyone was seated, "I have some news to share. The Journal of Applied Mathematical Methods has accepted a paper for publication in their spring issue. The paper introduces what they're calling the Wilson-Wright method for solving certain types of differential equations." He gestured toward Margaret. "Our own Margaret Wilson is the primary author. The review committee specifically noted the elegance of her approach and its pedagogical value. This is an exceptional achievement that will make a lasting contribution to the field." The classroom erupted in applause. Margaret sat frozen in her seat, overwhelmed by the moment. Publication. Recognition. At 78 years old, she had finally stepped fully into the identity she had held in her heart for so long. After class, Tyler approached her desk. "Congratulations, Mrs. Wilson. That's really cool about your paper." "Thank you, Tyler," she replied, touched by his sincerity. He shifted his weight nervously. "I was wondering. I'm thinking about specializing in differential equations, and since you're basically an expert now..." He took a deep breath. "Would you consider continuing to tutor me next semester?" "I'd pay you, of course," Margaret smiled. "I'd be happy to work with you, Tyler, no payment necessary. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Never assume you know the limits of someone else's capabilities, or your own for that matter." As the winter break approached, Dr. Chen invited Margaret to speak to his department colleagues about her work and her unusual journey in mathematics. Standing before a room of professors and graduate students, Margaret felt a lifetime of hidden knowledge finally finding its voice. "I never set out to develop a new method," she told them. "I was simply trying to understand beauty when I saw it. Mathematics has been my private joy for most of my life, but I've learned that knowledge gains something precious when it's shared." In the audience, her daughter Karen sat beside her granddaughter Beth, both of them witnessing a side of Margaret they had never fully known existed. Beside them sat Priya, Anthony, Lisa, and even Tyler, students who had become something between disciples and friends. As Margaret demonstrated her approach on the department's whiteboard, her hand steady and confident, she realized that the classroom had given her something she never expected to find at 78. Not just recognition for her mathematical abilities, but a community where she truly belonged. Life had denied her the opportunity to become the mathematician she had dreamed of being as a young woman. But it had given her something perhaps more valuable in the end, the chance to show that learning, growth, and contribution have no expiration date. That genius can hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge, and that it's never too late to become who you might have been.